A thin ribbon of moonlight lay across the cloud tops, bright enough to betray a bomber's shape, but not bright enough to save it. The Lancaster was already wounded, one engine rough and smoking, the rear gunner reporting nothing but darkness behind them. The crew had survived the flak belt and the turning searchlights over the Ruhr. They thought the worst was over. Then a quiet, pulsing tone filled the German headset, miles away. Steady, confident, closing. In the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 110, the pilot held the aircraft perfectly level, while his radar operator hunched forward, eyes fixed on a small cathode ray tube. A white blip floated on the screen like a ghost. The operator called distance and angle, with the calm rhythm of a man reading a clock. The pilot didn't look for the bomber with his eyes. He didn't need to. He flew the instrument, not the sky. The Bf 110 slid underneath the Lancaster's blind cone. Engines throttled back to keep the approach silent. The bomber above was a black cliff. No tracer. No warning. Just the shape, growing larger, until the German pilot could make out the underside details, the bomb bay doors, the ribs of the wings, the faint glow of exhaust. He eased the nose up, not toward the tail turret, not into the stream of guns, but into the bomber's belly. Then two cannon mounted at an upward angle behind the cockpit spoke once, twice, in a short burst. From below, the hits looked small. From inside the Lancaster, they were the end of the world. Fuel ignited. Fire raced through the wing root. The bomber lurched as if struck by a giant hand. The intercom filled with shouts, then with the sound that every night crew feared most, the cracking roar of structure coming apart. The German pilot didn't chase the falling wreck. He couldn't afford emotion. Another echo was already forming on the scope. Another return in the bomber stream. Another target in the dark. Tonight, he wasn't flying a failed heavy fighter. Tonight, he was part of the deadliest system Germany had ever built for the night sky. This happened over Western Europe in the middle years of the war, when the air offensive turned the hours after midnight into a second front. The aircraft doing the hunting was the Messerschmitt Bf 110, a machine that had been ridiculed and mauled in daylight and written off as a mistake. And yet, in the darkness, it became one of the Luftwaffe's most efficient killers, because it was never really just an airplane. It was a cockpit at the sharp end of a network. Radar masts on the ground, controllers in bunkers, searchlights, flak belts, radio beams, and finally, a twin-engine fighter that could carry the weight of electronics, extra crew, and heavy guns without falling out of the sky. The story is not about a miracle weapon. It is about adaptation under pressure. How an aircraft that failed its original promise found a new purpose so perfectly suited to its strengths that it helped shape the deadliest years of the night war. And it is also about the men on both sides who learned, too late, that darkness does not protect you. It only changes the rules. To understand how the Bf 110 became a nightmare after midnight, it helps to return to the time when it was supposed to be something else entirely. In the late 1930s, Germany imagined a new kind of air combat problem. The Luftwaffe wanted a long-range destroyer, a heavy fighter that could escort bombers, range deep, and overwhelm smaller aircraft with concentrated firepower. Messerschmitt's answer was sleek, fast for its size, and built around 2 engines and 2 or 3 crew members. It carried more fuel than single-engine fighters and enough guns in the nose to punch holes quickly rather than dance in turning circles. In the opening campaigns of the war, that concept looked plausible. Over Poland, Norway, and France, the Bf 110's range and firepower had moments where they felt decisive. Against opponents caught by surprise or forced into bad positions, a well-flown twin-engine fighter could strike hard and then leave. Early victories hardened the idea that the destroyer concept might work, but an aircraft's reputation is often made not by what it can do in ideal conditions, but by what it cannot do when the enemy is ready. When the war moved over the Channel, the Bf-110 ran into a brutal truth. Daylight over Britain demanded agility, climb, and acceleration under constant threat from Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Bf-110 could hit hard, but it could not turn like a single-engine fighter, and it could not always choose the terms of engagement. The very features that made it stable and long-legged made it vulnerable in the swirling, close-in combat that defined the Battle of Britain. German crews learned what it felt like to be hunted rather than hunting. A heavy fighter attacked from above could still kill. A heavy fighter surprised from behind could die in seconds. The rear gun gave comfort, but not safety. The extra crewman became another life to lose. The Bf-110 began to acquire a reputation that stuck like oil. Too big, too slow to turn, too visible, too easy to set on fire if caught wrong. There is a particular kind of humiliation in aviation. A machine designed for dominance, forced into a role it cannot survive. By late 1940, the Luftwaffe already had enough evidence that the Bf-110 would not be the daylight escort that German planners had imagined. If the story ended there, the aircraft would be remembered as an instructive failure. But the war did not stop at sunset. It shifted. As Britain sought to carry the fight into German territory, RAF Bomber Command increasingly moved its offensive to the hours of darkness. Night flying reduced losses from fighters, but it introduced a new enemy. Navigation errors, weather, collisions, and the constant fear of unseen defenses. German cities began to burn in the night, and the German response evolved with the urgency of a nation under bombardment. At first, Germany's night defense relied heavily on flak, searchlights, and scattered fighter patrols that were little more than guesswork. A pilot could take off into a black sky and spend hours searching for a target he might never see. Interceptions depended on luck, moonlight, and the chance alignment of searchlights that could trap a bomber like an insect in a jar. Then the Germans began building something different, a structured, controlled night defense that treated the sky like a grid. The architect of this system was General Joseph Kammhuber, and the framework that grew under him became known as the Kammhuber Line. It was a chain of radar stations and command posts stretching across the approaches to the Reich, divided into boxes that could detect incoming aircraft and guide fighters toward them. Within these sectors, radar like Freya could provide early warning, while more precise sets like Würzburg helped refine tracking. Searchlights and flak formed a layered barrier. Fighters were assigned to specific zones and directed by controllers who could see the battle from a screen rather than from a cockpit. This structure needed an aircraft that could stay aloft, carry equipment, and operate with a crew that could divide tasks in the dark. A single-seat fighter pilot at night was alone with a compass, instruments, and fear. A 2- or 3-man crew could turn night fighting into a team sport. The Bf-110, rejected by daylight, fit the night war's needs with uncomfortable perfection. It had space in the nose and fuselage for radios and, later, airborne interception radar. It had endurance to loiter near expected routes. It had 2 engines, an insurance policy over blacked-out countryside where a forced landing could be fatal. It had stability that made instrument flying less punishing. And it had the firepower to destroy heavy bombers quickly, because at night there was rarely time for prolonged pursuit. In the early period, before airborne radar became common, a typical interception might unfold like a staged play. A controller would detect bombers on ground radar and direct a night fighter into a Himmelbett box. Searchlights would probe the sky, and flak would mark altitude. Somewhere above, A bomber crew would see white beams sweeping like fingers, trying to catch a wing or fuselage. A German Bf-110 crew might be orbiting in darkness, waiting for the moment the sky turned bright. When a searchlight locked onto a bomber, the world would change instantly. The bomber became a lit target, the night fighter an invisible blade. From the RAF side, those moments were pure terror. A Wellington or Hampton crew might watch another aircraft suddenly freeze in a cone of light, and then vanish in a flash as cannon shells hit. Sometimes the bomber went down trailing fire like a comet. Sometimes it simply broke apart, leaving falling fragments and a brief, sickening silence on the intercom as crews wondered if they were next. But even this system had limits. Searchlights and ground radar could help, but they were constrained by weather and by the chaos of mass raids. A bomber stream could overload the boxes. Cloud could hide everything. And the RAF was not standing still. The next leap came when night fighters began to carry their own eyes. Airborne interception radar, mounted in a fighter and operated by a crewman, changed the geometry of the night war. Instead of waiting for searchlights to reveal a target, a Bf-110 could find bombers in darkness from several kilometers away. The radar operator could talk the pilot onto a target as if guiding him down a corridor. It was still difficult, still dangerous, but it no longer depended on moonlight. This shift turned the Bf-110 into something new. A hunter that could locate prey before prey even knew it was being stalked. The radar sets themselves were imperfect. Early airborne systems had limited range and could be confused by ground clutter. Their antenna arrays added drag and reduced speed. The screens were crude by modern standards, a dance of blips that demanded training and calm. Yet, in the hands of a competent crew, they were enough. A night interception now had a different rhythm. The ground controller would still guide the fighter toward the bomber stream, but at the critical moment, the crew switched from being guided to doing the guiding. The radar operator would call out, "Contact! Range! Closing!" The pilot would adjust throttle and heading with small movements, careful not to overshoot. The bomber would appear as a vague shadow, then as a shape, then as an outline against the faint light of cloud. One of the most dangerous parts came at the end. A bomber's defensive guns were still lethal even at night. If a night fighter approached from behind and above, it risked the tail turret. If it approached from the side, it risked crossing arcs of fire. The Germans experimented with attack angles that minimized exposure and maximized surprise. This is where the Bf-110's evolution became truly sinister. Instead of attacking from the bomber's rear, German crews increasingly favored approaches from below and behind into the blind spots where many bomber crews had the least visibility. And then, as the war progressed, some night fighters were equipped with upward-firing cannon known by the nickname Schräge Musik. The name sounded almost playful. The effect was not. An upward-firing installation allowed a fighter to slide under a bomber and fire into its most vulnerable areas, the wing roots, fuel tanks, and fuselage, without entering the tail gunner's direct line of fire. The bomber crew might not even realize it was under attack until flames erupted, because at night there was no obvious tracer stream coming from behind. Sometimes the first sign was a sudden, violent jolt. Sometimes it was fire spreading across the cockpit windows. Sometimes it was the captain shouting a command that came too late. This tactic produced a new kind of fear among RAF crews. The sense that death could come from a place you weren't even watching. Micro-stories, the kind that spread through squadrons like campfire tales, began to form around the night fighters. A returning crew would talk about a bomber that exploded without warning, as if struck by unseen flak. Another crew would swear they saw a shadow pass beneath them, too close, too deliberate. And then, Gradually, the rumor became a doctrine. There were fighters under the stream, climbing into you. For the Bf 110 crews, the night war became a grim routine of precision and nerve. A typical mission could stretch for hours. They took off into darkness, climbed to an assigned altitude, and waited as the controller's voice guided them toward echoes that represented hundreds of men in aluminum tubes. Every engagement was a calculation of fuel, ammunition, and risk. If the crew found a target too far from base, they might kill a bomber and then realize they had used the last safe margin of fuel to do it. If the radar set failed, they were blind. If the weather collapsed, they might die without ever seeing an enemy. One night, fighter crew might score multiple victories in a single sortie, and the next night be missing forever. On the RAF side, Bomber Command began concentrating its aircraft into tighter streams to overwhelm defenses. The logic was ruthless. Mass reduced the time a bomber spent over defended areas and diluted the ability of night fighters to isolate targets. The first massive raids that tested this logic hit German cities with a scale that surprised even the planners. In one famous example, more than 1,000 bombers were dispatched in a single night against Cologne in 1942. The sky above the city became a conveyor belt of aircraft. Fires created their own weather. Searchlights stabbed upward. Flak burst like black flowers, and German night fighters hunted in the gaps between chaos and routine. A Bf 110 crew entering that storm had a strange advantage and a strange handicap. The advantage was targets, so many that the problem was not finding a bomber, but finding one separated enough to kill without immediately being rammed by another aircraft or losing control in wake turbulence. The handicap was overload radar screens filled with echoes, controllers talking over each other, the confusion of multiple interceptions happening at once. In those nights, the Bf 110's role as a night fighter was not a solitary duel. It was industrial combat, the grinding conversion of bomber mass into wreckage, one interception at a time. Then the RAF introduced a simple countermeasure that struck at the heart of Germany's system. In 1943, during the air battles over Hamburg, the British began dropping strips of metal foil, window, known to the Germans as Duppel. On radar, these strips created false echoes that turned clean screens into blizzards. Ground controllers could no longer track bomber streams with clarity. The carefully built grid of boxes and vectors began to collapse into uncertainty. For a German night fighter crew, it felt like the lights had gone out in a room they thought they understood. A controller might direct them toward a contact that dissolved into nothing. A radar operator might see 1,000 ghosts on his scope, and none of them be the bomber he needed. For a moment, it looked as if the night defense had been blinded. The response was not elegant, but it was fast. Germany adjusted tactics and equipment. New radar sets with different frequencies appeared. Fighters were increasingly directed into the bomber stream and allowed to hunt more freely, rather than being confined to rigid boxes. The goal became to place the hunters among the prey and let their own airborne radar and crew coordination do the rest. This was the era when the Bf 110's later night fighter variants came to define the role. Aircraft like the Bf 110G series carried more powerful engines, heavier armament, and improved radar installations. The nose bristled with antenna arrays, the cockpit filled with additional boxes and dials. The extra drag reduced speed, but speed was not the prime currency in night fighting. Position was. A successful interception was less about being faster than a bomber and more about being where the bomber didn't expect you to be. German crews also began using passive sensors and cues to locate bombers. RAF aircraft carried their own electronics-like navigation aids and radar for target finding, and anything that emitted could, in principle, be detected. The night war became a contest of signals. Transmit, jam, change frequency, adapt. Every technological step by one side created a counter-step by the other. And through all of it, the Bf-110 remained central because it could carry the burden. A single-seat fighter could not easily accommodate a radar operator, a bulky radar set, and heavy cannon while retaining endurance. The Bf-110 could. The same size that made it clumsy in daylight made it capable at night. The psychological experience aboard a bomber began to change in parallel. Early in the night offensive, fear came from searchlights and flak. Later, fear came from invisibility. A Lancaster crew over Germany might fly for hours without seeing anything but cloud and faint fires on the horizon. Then, a warning might come from a different aircraft. Corkscrew now! The pilot would throw the bomber into a violent diving turn, then reverse, then climb, trying to spoil the aim of an unseen attacker. The rear gunner's world was a narrow slice of darkness where any flash could be death. And sometimes the first sign wasn't tracer at all. Sometimes the bomber simply caught fire from below. Imagine the moment from inside the Lancaster. The engineer scanning gauges, the navigator plotting a course by dead reckoning and radio aids, the wireless operator listening for signals, the bomb aimer exhausted after the run. No one is looking straight down. They are watching ahead, behind, and the thin edges of sky. Then a sudden orange bloom erupts beneath the wing, and the aircraft shudders as if it has collided with something solid. The intercom fills with overlapping voices, the pilot fighting for control as the aircraft lists. In seconds, the bomber becomes a furnace. That was the most terrifying genius of the upward attack. It turned the bomber's own structure and fuel into the killing mechanism, and it stole time to identify, time to react, time to escape. The Bf-110 night fighter itself was not invulnerable. It had enemies that were perfectly designed to ruin its confidence. One of the deadliest was the de Havilland Mosquito. Fast, sleek, and capable at night, the Mosquito could catch German night fighters during vulnerable moments climbing, returning to base, or forming up. RAF intruder operations sought to ambush German aircraft near airfields, when landing lights and predictable patterns made them easier to find. A Bf-110 crew returning home might be low on fuel, tired, radar switched off to reduce interference, and then suddenly the dark behind them would fill with tracer as a Mosquito attacked. For German night fighter crews, the Mosquito represented a cruel reversal. The hunter could become prey in the last minutes of a mission, when the war felt almost finished. More than one German crew survived the bomber stream, only to die in sight of their own runway. This duel in the dark added another layer of stress. Night fighting already demanded concentration under fatigue. Now it demanded vigilance even in the safe phases. It forced German crews to think defensively, to vary routes, to coordinate landing procedures, to add flak protection around airfields, each change consuming resources and attention. As the war moved into 1944, the night battle intensified and expanded. The RAF pushed deeper, targeting not only industrial cities, but transportation networks and oil infrastructure. Raids on places like Berlin became grueling tests of endurance for both attackers and defenders. On some nights, the bomber stream was scattered by weather, navigation errors, or diversion tactics. On other nights, it was tight and predictable, and German night fighters waited like wolves along the route. There were nights when the defense achieved devastating results operations that bomber crews remembered for the rest of their lives. One of the most infamous was the raid toward Nuremberg in the spring of 1944, when conditions and tactical circumstances combined to expose the bomber force to heavy interception. Bomber crews spoke of fighters everywhere, of aircraft exploding in the darkness, of the sky filled with burning wreckage. German night fighter crews spoke of targets so numerous that the challenge was choosing which one to kill before it vanished into cloud. In such nights, the Bf-110's strengths were brutally clear. Its heavy forward-firing armament could tear through a bomber's wing structure and engines. Its crew coordination allowed the pilot to fly, while the radar operator guided and the rear gunner watched for threats. Its endurance gave it time to make multiple attacks. The airplane that could not win a turning fight over Britain had become a platform for systematic interception. Yet even as it reached its most lethal form, the strategic tide was turning. The Allies did not need to solve the night war with a single invention. They solved it by accumulation: better jamming, better navigation, varied routes, decoys, long-range night fighters, improved defensive gunnery training, and sheer pressure applied night after night. The German defense faced an exhaustion problem. Even if a Bf-110 crew was skilled, they could not be everywhere. Even if radar improved, it could be jammed or deceived. Even if tactics adapted, the enemy adapted back. And behind the cockpits, Germany faced the industrial and training limits that had haunted it from the beginning. Night fighting consumed resources that were difficult to replace. Radar sets required skilled technicians and spare parts. Engines needed maintenance and fuel. Training a competent night fighter crew took time: instrument flying, formation discipline, radar interpretation, controlled approaches, gunnery under low visibility. As the war dragged on, fuel shortages and losses eroded that training pipeline. Late-war crews often went into combat with less experience than earlier crews had received in training alone. By 1945, the night sky was no longer simply a hunting ground. It was a collapsing environment. Airfields were bombed. Communications were disrupted. Fuel was scarce. The defense network that had once guided fighters with confidence began to fracture. A Bf-110 could still take off, still carry radar, still kill if it found a target. But the system that made it so deadly was failing. There is an image that captures the tragedy of late-war night fighting. A twin-engine night fighter climbing into darkness on a cold runway. Engines coughing in winter air. Crew members knowing that even if they survive the mission, they may return to an airfield that no longer exists, or to a fuel dump that is empty, or to a command structure that cannot guide them. The aircraft remains capable. The war machine around it is dying. And yet, the Bf-110's transformation remains one of the most revealing in Deadliest aviation. It is a case study in how failure depends on the question being asked. As a daylight destroyer, the Bf-110 could not impose itself against modern single-engine fighters when the enemy controlled the engagement. It was too large to dogfight on equal terms. It paid for its range and firepower with agility and vulnerability in the wrong kind of combat. But as a night fighter, the same airframe became a weapon. Its size became space for radar and crew. Its stability became a platform for instrument interception. Its twin engines became endurance and insurance. Its heavy armament became the ability to end an engagement in seconds, which mattered when visibility and time were limited. And its very existence within a broader defense network turned it into a sharp tool one that could be directed, concentrated, and used repeatedly. The failed Bf-110 did not become deadly because it suddenly turned better than a Spitfire. It became deadly because the war created a new environment, and the aircraft's real strengths finally matched the problem. It was a machine that needed darkness, radios, and teamwork. When those elements were present, it could turn the night into a trap. For the bomber crews who flew into that trap, The Bf-110 was rarely seen and never forgotten. Survivors described the night war as a constant tension between routine and sudden catastrophe. A mission could feel like hours of nothing, followed by seconds of fire. In those seconds, the bomber's advantages numbers, altitude, defensive turrets could be made irrelevant by a fighter sliding into position beneath them, guided by electronics and practiced voices. For the German crews who flew the Bf-110, the night war was a grim craft. It demanded discipline rather than bravado, patience rather than speed, and trust between men who could not see the enemy until the end. It offered moments of lethal clarity, one target, one burst, one burning fall, and then returned them to darkness, searching for another echo while fuel ticked away. When the war ended, the Bf-110 was often remembered for its early failures, because daylight defeats are visible and famous. But in the years when Germany fought most desperately to defend its cities, the Bf-110 was not a joke. It was the backbone of a nocturnal defense, a Predator aircraft shaped by necessity, and a reminder that in modern war, an airplane's destiny is not fixed at the drafting table. The Bf-110 began the conflict as an escort meant to protect bombers. It ended as a bomber killer that turned protection into pursuit. In the daylight, it was exposed. In the night, it was at home. And for thousands of men who crossed the continent in blacked-out aircraft, the most dangerous thing in the sky was not what they could see. It was what they could not.